Irenosen Okojie, thank you for speaking to Writers Mosaic. I'm Gabriel Gbadamosi, and I'm an avid reader, a fan of your work, which quite literally sort of knocks the socks off me, down to the level of the sentence. Your sentences begin somewhere and end up wildly somewhere else. It seems as though to read a sentence of yours is to feel every molecule within the sentence just jumping, like you're boiling it. Where do you think the energy in your writing comes from?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. And what a wonderful way to describe my writing. I'm really chuffed and honoured because I'm an equally big fan of your writing. I don't know where the energy comes from. I think a real curiosity about the world, about life, about art, about creativity. I'm always seeking something, I think, both in the writing and in my own personal life. And I'm always trying to, I guess, intermingle the two in ways that feel exciting and fresh and dynamic. I like to challenge myself as a writer. You know, I'm writing for not just me now, I think, but Irenosen as a young reader, and thinking about the things that I would have loved to have read, but also setting myself and people who look like me within those worlds. I grew up reading the likes of Roald Dahl, who just, blew me away with the kind of weirdness and zaniness of his writing and his storytelling about young people. But I didn't feel seen in that, and I wanted to change it. So I think it comes from that. I also think it comes from, and I'm going to give her a shout out as well, the incredible June Jordan. When I first started writing and trying to find my voice, I was reading a poem of hers a day, a bit like having an apple a day. And I love the dexterity of her work, not only an amazing thinker and political commentator, but also just the way she lived as an artist. She was somebody who cared about community, cared about the world, but she had this playfulness with form as well. So there was all sorts going on when you looked at her poems, at her criticism, at her essays. So this mixture of, I guess, reading writers who I admire, the likes of Toni Morrison, Amos Tutuola, Margaret Atwood, all these incredible authors and writers and thinkers, but also wanting to create my own space within that. I was very conscious that I didn't want to mimic all of those writers because they all occupy their own unique spaces. I wanted to carve out a space that felt like me, like myself and my voice. And how do I get to that space? How do I feel like myself in the writing? Who can give me permission to do this? So it was that curiosity, like I said, to want to be seen, but also to want to like push the boundaries with form and have a sense of joy in the work, have a sense of playfulness.
Listening to you now and rereading the pieces that we've commissioned from you, it strikes me that I'd love to read a creative non-fiction book by you, just to see how a look at the world we all think we live in, the way that world would look. You've written short stories, collections of short stories, novels. You began life in arts administration, but arts administration with poetry. Have you been a poet as well? Because I see the evidence of poetry within your work.
Yeah, I think I'm a shy poet. I think I've not shown any of my poetry to the world, but actually it's a big part of my practice because I write about 10 or 12 poems a day, like short ones, like just strange little poems, and they really anchor me, I think, to the writing. So it's a form that I love, but I am actually scared to put my poetry out because I don't know what people would make of it. But it helps me process, it helps me get into the space. And like you said, I started off working in performance poetry. I worked for Apples and Snakes for quite a bit, and I was introduced to live poetry, the immediacy of it, which I loved. It felt very different to poems on the page, which I also really love and appreciate. But there was something exciting about being in that space. So this mix of seeing live poetry, imbibing that, as well as reading poets like, I've mentioned June Jordan, Sylvia Plath, and interesting, women writers and poets. That unleashed a fire in me, I think, because I felt like I had stuff to say. And I was, this young black woman trying to make my way in the world, hustling, working in arts administration, doing what young people do to survive. And art felt like such a powerful part of who I wanted to be. And I was slowly getting sucked into that world. And I loved it. It felt like, this wonderful space where you could really take the world to task, but also produce beautiful things. And for me, I felt a sense of freedom in that space that, I sometimes didn't feel out in the world, because I felt so often this kind of disparity between being incredibly judged or being invisible, and this is what people of colour have to navigate.
Okay. Well, let's leave a space open here for the appearance in due course of some poetry from Irenosen. But let me start perhaps with the short stories. There are several collections: Nudie Branch, Speak Gigantula, perhaps more in the works. But what I find astonishing about both of them, both of these collections, is that each of the stories is sui generis. It's its own thing. It doesn't seem related to any of the other stories. And in fact, the worlds that you conjure are entirely different universes at every moment. So one would expect a young Nigerian British writer to have a kind of cosmopolitanism about them, but yours jump from Japan to the Middle East to the Nordic countries to outer space, a speculative future from which we look back at what it used to be like being human. There seems to be no limit to the worlds that you conjure. Can you give me some sort of rationale about kind of how your mise en scène, your worlds are so vastly different?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously I love my cultural background. Being Nigerian, it's so rich. And actually, ironically and interestingly enough, I think that was where I got my first taste of the wild and the wonderful in terms of the fables. And you will know this, Gabrielle. There is a rich history of fable and griot and oral storytelling. And I remember hearing those kind of magical tales as a kid, actually visiting my grandmother and sitting around eating yams.
I was never fond of the boiled. It was never kind of quite my thing, but pounded and pounded. Fermented.
Yeah, pounded.
Love it.
Pounded is fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. But you know what I mean? Just kind of being in that space and hearing these wild stories that would change depending on who was telling you them. So I think that sowed a seed. And then growing up in London, you're exposed to so many different cultures. My best friend is Indian. We grew up together in secondary school. We're still friends now. And I was exposed to her culture. And I had friends from all backgrounds. In my 20s, I had a Malaysian boyfriend. So during that period, I was really interested in Asian cinema. And I was like imbibing Japanese cinema, Korean cinema, all these wacky, brilliant films. So I guess my palette and my taste is just from everywhere, really.
Okay, let's take that. A woman of the world, but actually of worlds that you yourself have conjured.
Yeah, that too.
Let me take you to one particular short story. We could have taken any number of the short stories, but I'm going to focus on one which comes in an epistolary form. It's a letter, and it's entitled Anonymous Jones. It's a young woman who doesn't quite find her way in life, ends up in the army unexpectedly, and there her best friend is blown into pieces by a bomb in Basra. So on the one hand, it's sort of very on the nose about contemporary British experience of the world, but it's also doing a number of other things. Let me put a couple of lines from the story to you and ask you to comment. The first one is, It's hard being a young person these days. You feel invisible and lost.
Yeah. It just touched on a comment I made earlier, really, which is, yeah, I felt like that, during my 20s. Sometimes I was very sure of who I was, and then other times it was like, how do you make your way in this world, and depending on what's going on in your life, what job you have, what boyfriend you've broken up with, where you're living, you can feel kind of unmoored or anchored, and depending on, the sort of community support you have as well. So I think it's hard for young people. It certainly was for me. I mean, it's probably harder now, but much harder now. But I wanted to capture that sense of that feeling of being unsure in the piece. Hence those lines.
Sometimes you don't get to choose how the story goes.
Yeah, well, you could take that any number of ways, really. You can have by that, I guess I mean, you can have every intention of wanting to end up in a particular space or
write a straight story. But I'm Irenosen. What do you want?
But exactly, this is asking too much of me. Literally, it's got to go off in tangents, and it's got to surprise me writing it. And that's the thing. I like to leave room for that because I find so much joy in that. Yes, I have a sense of, a rough idea of what I want the story to be, but not the finer details, not necessarily what's going to happen in the middle. Yeah. I might know what happens in the beginning, but I don't know where it's going to go. And the characters tell me, when I get into that space, there's a Renaissance idea of where it might go. And then when the characters come to life, they're saying, oh, we're going here, love. We know you've thought about that, but this is happening.
It is lovely the way that you kind of evade the kind of the strictures of identity politics within your writing. That what you write is not what one would expect or what the publishing industry might expect from a young kind of Nigerian British girl. This is a woman from outer space looking back on us ants crawling around, and we become ants, and then it's the story of one ant,
exactly,
and then the architect of the tube down which they've all been flushed. It's quite extraordinary. Here goes another one, and I'm going to kind of press you on this. The words levitation and abracadabra make me happy because they're loaded with possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, levitation is rising above everything and reaching a new level of transformation, reaching for things that you can only get if you take yourself to particular heights. And you don't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily have to be given to you. You kind of have to fight for it, I think, is my intention and my thinking behind that. And with abracadabra, it's just like, it's such a strange word, even to say it in the mouth, abracadabra, the feeling of it, the roundness of saying it. It's almost like a kind of incantation in a way, abracadabra, manifestation.
Isn't there that quality within your writing that you're kind of calling into existence, rather magically, that which has not existed? You're really involved in very deep acts of imaginative creation. Does that ever make you kind of feel that you are in dialogue with kind of perhaps esoteric, but perhaps newly invented sorts of understandings of the possible, of reality?
I love that. I love that you frame it that way. That's so beautiful. I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. And when you're in that space, when I'm in the writing space, it's almost like being in a trance, especially the time at which I write. So I wake up very early to do the writing, usually 6:30 in the morning, 7 a.m. I'm kind of half asleep, half awake. So it kind of makes sense if you think about where my head goes and where the writing goes. I'm not of this world necessarily. I'm still of the dream world. And I like the idea. I like to write before everybody else wakes up. There's such a power in it, and it really lends itself to being able to manifest things, to conjure things, to speak to ancestral spirits who might be talking to you at that time, you know, to hear what they have to say, to translate it, and to kind of open up the space in ways that you wouldn't even imagine. And it's having, like, in that space, there is a kind of confidence comes that I don't know how to explain it. It's something that I've cultivated over the years, just trusting that instinct, you know, trusting that those worlds will come, that if I keep sitting with those characters and if I keep sitting in that space, it will develop in magical ways that I couldn't have imagined. So
people very often identify magical with kind of the cuddly, with Disney, with the sense that this is an incantation which is soft and gentle. Not always in your work.
Not with
Here's
my work.
perhaps a final line from Anonymous Jones. I told her, a pregnant woman within the story, I told her I hoped her child had webbed feet. That's a curse.
Yeah.
The power of the curse within your work. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, and a kind of barbedness with that particular character as well, you know, and edginess. I think my women characters always have that complexity to them, that darkness to them.
They're healers and killers.
They're healers and killers, and, you know, they will love you but cut you quick as well, because, you know, if it comes down to your survival or their survival, they know who they're going to choose. So it's really interesting to be able to show that element. And I love writing messy, complicated, dark women. And I love the fact that you might not always get what their intentions are or why they've done the things that they've done. But for me, the trick is to kind of create a sort of empathy for them in a way, you know, to kind of bring you closer to their humanness. I think that's really important, and showing those different sides to them, you know, showing the loving side, showing the confusion, the vulnerability, the sexuality as well, and the cruelty, you know, because the world is cruel to them. So sometimes as a result of that, it can come out in these like barbed ways.
My mother always warned me about the curse. She said, be careful because it rebounds.
Yeah.
Have you thought of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I say good things through my characters too. Let's hope those can counter the curse.
In your latest novel, Curandera,
Yeah.
Therese, let's take her. She's a healer. She's a killer.
Yeah.
She subsists within that space that many of your female characters subsist. They're almost kind of channeling a power which is greater than them, but it's a power which doesn't have an easy Christian morality of good or bad. It is a curative. It is fatal. Do you see a link between your writing and your writing of these characters and, as it were, a very human situation that either you as a writer or any of your readers might subsist in which there is the possibility of great damage as well as a possibility to restore and to heal? Do you have a sense that in your writing these are still attempts at healing which may go very badly?
I love that you said that, because it kind of touches on the complexity of what I'm trying to do. You know, I said to you earlier when I was reading that I can't not write. Even if I wasn't published, I would still write, because for me it is a healing space. It is a transformative space to take all the personal traumas I've been through, and there have been quite a lot, I'm sure, for lots of writers and creators, but certainly in my case, if I didn't have the writing space, I don't know what I would have done, because I genuinely feel that the writing space saved my life. You know, it was also a hard space, you know, finding my way in the beginning, wondering whether or not I'd be published or if anyone would even get me, or, you know, because I was kind of trying to see where I could fit. And it was sort of difficult to see where or how that would happen. But I knew instinctively that I had found my voice, and and it was transforming my life in ways that I couldn't quite articulate. I just knew that I wanted to keep coming back to create these stories, to keep writing these characters, and that through that process of incorporating both my lived experiences and some of the lived experiences of, you know, people that I knew, as well as the conjuring, you know, the creating of the new that you referred to earlier, felt like a kind of healing, felt like a kind of balm, but like a healing that was alive, you know, not kind of necessarily one dimension, you know, it's multi-dimensional. It's alive, it mutates, it changes, and I don't know when I'm going to feel like, when I'm writing something, you know, especially if you're writing something painful, you can really feel that pain in the process. But by the end of it, you know, you read it when you come back to it and you go, okay, that's what I was trying to do. You don't necessarily know when you're doing it. This is the thing that's really interesting, and I'm sure you'll recognize this, Gabrielle. You don't necessarily know what your intention is. You're just trying to figure it out whilst enjoying the process of creating that world and the characters.
In your first novel, Butterfly Fish, it moves fairly fluidly between the present day and, is it something like 17th or 18th century Benin?
Yeah.
Very interestingly, stylistically, the sections which are set in Benin in the past have a kind of Nigerian folkloric kind of style. You kind of fall into it. It's very easy. It's a way of telling. And then sharply they're contrasted with the contemporary moment in which the young woman is having something like a psychotic breakdown. And these are written like the most extreme forms of late 20th century African American fiction. And the contrast of the two styles is very, very marked. And then there's the title, Butterfly Fish, this tropical sort of almost aquarium type, kind of beautifully coloured, kind of angel type fish. What was going on, would you say, back then for you as a writer?
It's a really interesting question. Firstly, with the Benin section, I was kind of obsessed with that from a young age, because my father told me about the Benin Kingdom, and it was like he planted something in me, you know. And then growing up in the UK, I was like, why don't we learn about this in history? This is really...
Yeah, because we got the Benin bronzes and they're the most expensive things that anyone's got, and then we want to give them back.
And it's just like, we don't want to give them back. I'm like, this whole history happened, and this, you know, this amazing kingdom existed, and it, you know, that happened in my country. So I was kind of obsessed, really, just by the power of it all, and it sort of imaginatively intrigued me, the idea of reimagining history. But also I noticed that there hadn't been much written about Benin in fiction, and I was like, this is great, you know, ding 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 ding, I get to be free in this space, you know. Lots written in non-fiction but not fiction, so that was a lot of fun to research that, to talk to my father, to get him to send me old books, and he was really key in helping me research that. And I mean, he's now passed, but I look back on that period and him being involved in that process with real joy, and we were very connected. It was wonderful. And then writing about Joy, the character in the modern section of the novel, and the sort of breakdown, you know, the kind of mental unraveling that she goes through. That was really an important story to tell, I feel, because, again, we talk about mental health more these days, but I feel like there is a real stigma there still, to have conversations about it, particularly in communities of colour. So I really wanted to explore what it was like for this young woman who had recently lost her mother, wasn't really supported, and was kind of coming undone, and making these bad choices, dare I say, to not give it away to those that haven't read it and might be interested, making the bad choices and the kind of consequences of that, but also lovingly holding her in that, if that makes sense, by taking her through this journey So I wanted to capture all of that, all of those things.
You know that way that you never step down to the same river twice? Your work is so kinetic, so fast-moving, even within the sentence, that you can't really tell what are the stepping stones and what's the stream that you're kind of crossing. So let me take you to a short story from Nudibranch, the one for which you very deservedly won the Kane Prize for Fiction, Grace Jones. Grace Jones set, not only, but let's say in South London, Peckham, around there, involves a Grace Jones impersonator. And that idea of the impersonator and, as it were, having your experience in another identity.
Firstly, I just love the idea. Well, firstly, Grace. Let's talk about Grace. I'm a huge Grace Jones fan. I saw her in concert at the Royal Albert Hall. I mean, she was like 40 minutes late. Incredible. But I have always had a fascination with her and the kind of otherworldliness of her. And also how kind of rare she was in the black artistic space. So my mind was kind of, when I was thinking about this idea of somebody hiding within an impersonator, Grace came to mind, because she kind of just, she ticked all the boxes in terms of this otherworldliness that I was trying to capture. But then Sidra is very different to Grace. Sidra is the Grace Jones impersonator, and Sidra, I won't spoil it for people, but Sidra experiences a personal trauma in her young life, and she blames herself for this trauma. And in a way, I guess we see her punishing herself further down the line. So when we come to meet, adult Sidra, she is this sexual, sexy, curious young woman, possibly struggling with mental health issues too, but also extremely drawn to danger, and moving in these spaces, like you said, where she's encountering other impersonators, and who knows what their reasons are for hiding behind another character. But Sidra's certainly hiding from herself. The confidence that Grace gives her is really interesting, because it's kind of momentary, it's not consistent, and we see her in the piece actually when she's within that space and in that costume also panicking behind it as well, but also somebody who's kind of aware and alert to what's going on in these environments where people are seemingly really drawn to her, but then there is this kind of, but it's not really her, it's Grace, it's an illusion.
When I came to read it, I thought I've never quite read anything like this before. Wow. But let me take you to another short story which I particularly liked from Speak Gigantula, which is Walk with Sleep.
Yeah, so Walk with Sleep is really about people in this underworld of, should we say ghosts, I guess, in train stations, living alternate lives. They're trying to get out of the tube, and you really just encounter these characters within that space trying to make their way out.
One of the characters, just before they jumped, in a charity shop, bought a T-shirt with Betty Boop on the front. And when we meet her, down in this kind of reconfigured map of London, in which the tubes are the kind of great dark veins of the city, somehow the kind of space within which these ghosts or characters wander. But this particular character is still wearing that Betty Boop T-shirt, but Betty Boop is a living choric character to her,
right?
When she meets others, and it's commenting on the others. And is also expressing a part of her. Can you tell me how you manage that as a writer on a daily basis?
People have said that, like my stories, that things are just living and breathing. I guess a part of me wants it to feel alive, and wants you to see the character or characters in different ways. And with Betty Boop, Betty is such a known character for being so feminine, and being, in a particular way, a particular kind of tone that I think very much speaks to the male gaze. But this Betty I mean, you know, she's feisty. She's got a lot to say, and particularly when this character is trying to kind of get on with other characters in that world, she sort of stirs the pot, you know. And I'm always thinking about those ways to do that, to play a little bit, to be subversive. And it occurred to me that actually Betty could come alive. And, you know, be this voice in her head.
Your fiction is very marked by science fiction, speculative fiction.
Obviously, I want my own voice, and I'm, you know, trying to create a space for myself within this world. But I'm not one of these writers that will say, oh, this just came from nowhere, and not acknowledge the gifts that other incredible, amazing writers and artists gave me just by bringing me into their world. And that's all I want to do too, you know. I read Jamaica Kinsid when I was having the ideas for Nudibranch, and I was scared. And I have to say, everything I've ever written, I've been scared to write. Genuinely true. But I think there's something in that fear that excites me.
Curandero is about to come out.
Yeah.
Another novel. Do you see your future writing as still kind of following the kind of paths that you've already set up, or do you see any departures going forward?
I mean, I really don't know. I kind of just write on instinct. For me, it's just about the excitement of the ideas, always.
Talk to us a little bit about Afrofuturism as a space.
Well, it always really intrigued me, I guess. I was somebody who listened to Sun Ra, Faces the Place, you know, how could your mind not be blown? Like, where's he from? Read Octavia Butler, who I guess is considered the mother of Afrofuturism. And again, that sort of opened my mind up to the fact that there were these black writers and artists operating in this Afrofuturist space. You know, it was anchoring their interest and centering themselves in these worlds, without needing to have permission, you know, just doing it. So that stayed in my subconsciousness. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew that if I ever get to a position where I want to be able to open up the space for others, I don't know how that's going to manifest, but this is bubbling away. This is bubbling away underneath. So I'd curated like these series of events, and this was for Black to the Future. I just designed it. It was like, you know, dream curations, and it just felt great to be able to program these amazing black voices all doing really interesting things that perhaps audiences weren't as aware of as they should be, and it felt like a real privilege and a real joy. Also a lot of hard work. Well. You know this from how phenomenal Writers Mosaic is, and congratulations on that. I love the space so much. But it's your heart, it's your energy, it's an extension of you, you know, it's your vision, and you pour so much love into it. So that Black to the Future was able to kind of come to life, like manifested through sheer determination from myself and Sarah Ville, and Elliot Jack as well, I should mention, who's a consulting producer who does Book Slam stuff, which is great. So yeah, that was the joy. That was to kind of, open up the space.
Irenosen Okojie, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.